Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2024 Online Anti-Slavery Forum. My name is James Cockayne. I'm the Independent New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you here to the second forum for the year. The first one was held offline in real life, in person in Sydney in May. This is our first online anti-slavery forum. We're greatly looking forward to a very rich conversation with you over the next couple of days. 2 hours this morning, Sydney time, and 2 hours tomorrow evening. We have a very rich program for you. This morning we'll begin with an acknowledgement of country from Glenn Johnston. We'll then share with you the terms of engagement for these sessions, in particular the Brave Space guidelines developed by my office. We'll then come on to a rich panel focusing on the construction industry, involving Adam Whitefield from Achilles, Anwen Schumark, PhD candidate and graduate architect, Deepan Sumaya from Mirvac, and Sharon Prince, the founder and CEO of Grace Farms. That will then be followed by a panel on competition law and anti-slavery collaborations, which will feature Gina Cass-Gottlieb, the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, Dr. Darian McBain, chairperson of Be Slavery Free, and Kate Turner from First Sentier Investors, and also Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific. Lucy Forbes, the Principal Policy and Projects Manager, will wrap us up later this morning. Tomorrow, when we come back in the afternoon, Australia time, we'll start with remarks from the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, Professor Tomoya Obokata. Professor Obokata has been visiting Australia on an official country visit for the last 2 weeks, and tomorrow he will present an overview of his preliminary findings. We'll have 2 respondents to his remarks, Fiona David, the CEO of Fair Futures, and Moe Turaga, a survivor advocate. That will then be followed by a panel focusing on enabling remedy building, a survivor-led anti-slavery movement, which will include Angela Bucci, founder of Empowerful, Nancy Asiova from Survivor Alliance, and Muhammad Nazrul Islam Dipto from Winrock, all powerful advocates in this space. And that will be moderated by our own Sarah S., lived experience practice lead in my office. That will then be followed by our final session on ICT hardware supply chains, which will be moderated by Alex Coward, and will include a panel of Dongfang Han from China Labour Bulletin, Julie Pettigrew from Electronics Watch, and Mark Taylor, Senior Director of ISARA. What you'll notice is that all of our panels seek to combine both local Australian New South Wales expertise with a range of international expertise. We believe very much that to effectively combat modern slavery, we have to work together, not only here in New South Wales, but with partners all around the world to understand and implement best practice. It's important, though, that we understand that the context we're working in is very much an Australian context, and in that, with that background, it gives me great pleasure to turn over to Glenn Johnston, Director of Procurement and Business Support from Infrastructure New South Wales, and a member of my advisory panel, to ask Glenn if he would please acknowledge country. Over to you, Glenn.
Thanks, James. Warami Mitigar, which in my Darug Dalang or language means hello friends. My name is Glenn Johnston, and I am a proud Parramatta man of the Darug Nation. Parramatta is our traditional name for Parramatta. As we gather for this forum, physically dispersed but virtually connected, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of the Gadigal of the Darug Nation where I am today, as well as the traditional custodians of the lands that you are on. The Darug Nation covers what we know as the Greater Sydney Basin, not defined by lines on a map, but by the natural boundaries. The Hawkesbury River to the north, the Nepean River to the west, and the Georges River to the south. The Darug Nation is made up of 29 clans. Aboriginal peoples have been the custodians of the lands and waterways of Australia and have carried educational practices and storytelling for many thousands of years. Aboriginal peoples have practiced laws, customs, and languages, and have nurtured country by drawing upon cultural knowledge and through spiritual and physical connection to land, water, and resources. I pay sincere respects to my elders, past and present, for keeping our culture alive, and take pride that I am part of the longest living culture on Mother Earth. I would also like to reflect upon and remember the tens of thousands of Aboriginal people of the stolen generations, many of whom never made it home. The land we are on, the land where we live, work, breathe, eat and sleep on, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you, and I wish you well. Thanks, James.
Thanks so much, Glenn. We think it's very important here at the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner to recognise, as Glenn mentioned there, that we have amongst us in the Australian community, in the stolen generations, living survivors of practices that we would today call modern slavery. First Nations communities have been affected by modern slavery practices for upwards of 2 centuries now and are amongst the world's most significant survivors of practices that today constitute modern slavery. There's a great deal we can learn from those communities about what long-term survival and resilience in the face of modern slavery practices looks like, and that's something we continue to explore at the office through conversations with First Nations elders. I'm privileged today to be speaking to you from Gadigal country on the Eora Nation, and we welcome if any of you wanted to let us know through the Q&A function what country you're participating from today. Before we turn over to the first panel, I want to just let you know a couple of other ground rules about how we're going to be engaging over the next 2 days. You are welcome to pose questions for the panelists through the Q&A function that you'll find in your console. You are also invited to respect the Brave Space guidelines, which I'll come on and explain to you now. These are guidelines that have been developed from a tool originally created by Survivor Connections, an independent peer-led support group for survivors of modern slavery in Australia, and they align with similar guidelines implemented by Survivor Alliance and the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery internationally. They aim to make interactions in anti-slavery spaces safer. So there are 8 of them, and I'll just introduce them quickly for you now. First, we invite you to share space bravely and with empathy by acknowledging diversity. Creating safety starts, we believe, by making sure that diverse perspectives are valued and heard. Second, we encourage you in your interactions, your questions, and the panelists to enable learning. We aim to learn from each other and hold space for different views and opinions with empathy. That does mean that there may be mistakes, there may be misunderstandings, but we always strive to learn to be more respectful and to receive those mistakes and misunderstandings with empathy. To do this, we encourage the adoption of caring language. We should always use kind language and think the best of the people we're engaging with. Our choice of words should never invalidate someone else's experiences of abuse, nor take away their choice to identify as they feel is right for them. Similarly, we encourage that you avoid assumptions and comparisons. Allowing people to share their experiences in their own words can help to create safety. It's important to avoid assumptions. We can't ever know someone else's entire story, and it's a privilege to bear witness to what they choose to share with us. Fifthly, that requires respecting boundaries. This includes not pressuring someone to disclose more than they are comfortable with. You'll notice that we don't refer necessarily to people that are joining our panels as survivors or allies. There may be some people who don't wish to disclose whether they have lived experience of modern slavery or indeed adjacent harms. Sixthly, we encourage creation of a safe space that allows people to share authentically without fear of judgment. It's important to always consider everyone's well-being, especially when discussing trauma-related content, as we may touch on at certain times in the panels over the next 2 days. Part of that involves addressing power dynamics. We do see power dynamics emerging in any group setting, and it's important to be mindful of how power is distributed. It's important that all participants in this online anti-slavery forum have equitable opportunities to participate and contribute. And finally, we encourage a shame-sensitive and dignity-affirming approach. Understandably, many people feel shame around their experiences of trauma. It's important that we're all aware of how language or attitudes can perpetuate victim blaming, and we encourage that in the way that we all interact with each other over the next 2 days. So these are the Brave Space guidelines that we ask all participants in these sessions to abide by. For some of us, there will be feelings of trauma or concern or hurt raised by the conversations over the next 2 days. We have on the next slide information available to you about where you can go for help and support services, whether you're listening in from Australia or beyond. You might like to take a photo of this screen, take a screenshot, or if you're listening internationally, you might like to point your phone at that QR code. If you're listening from inside Australia, these are the numbers that we encourage you to consider engaging on the left, including our own office. Our hotline 1-800-FREEDOM is available and can provide confidential advice and support and refer you to other sources of assistance, particularly in the context of modern slavery. We also encourage engagement with the other services provided there on the left. So I think it's time that we moved into the substance that you've all come here for, and it gives me very great pleasure to introduce as the moderator of the first session, Robin Mellon. Robin is the CEO of Better Sydney, a project manager for the Property Council's Human Rights and Modern Slavery Working Group, and a board member with the UN Global Compact Network Australia. So Robin brings multiple perspectives across sustainability and human rights to this important discussion on construction. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that welcome, and welcome everyone to this session on bridging the gap between C-suite and worksite, in which we're going to explore modern slavery risks, but also solutions in the construction sector. Today, I'm joining from Camaradeal land, so pay respect to their thousands of generations of custodianship across this beautiful part of the Eora Nation. And as we start, we commit to those Brave Space guidelines. So we'll approach all these interactions with the intention of sharing and creating greater safety for everyone. Now, we have 4 amazing panelists today, as James said, who I'll introduce very briefly now before we dive into the detail of those complex construction supply chains. Anwin Schumark is an architect with expertise in commercial and residential architecture, master planning, and urban design, undertaking research at that intersection of human rights, architecture, construction, and the circular economy. And over the weekend, Anwin won an award for her paper on the social fabric of construction, addressing modern slavery risks in material specifications. So I'm really excited to be able to tease some of that detail out. Sharon Prince is CEO and founder of Grace Farm Foods and the Grace Farm Foundation, and launched the groundbreaking movement Design for Freedom, looking at how forced labor is embedded into the very foundations of our buildings and what we do about that. Deepan Samaya is responsible sourcing manager at Australian property development, investment and retail services leader Mirvac, with and zero emissions solutions involving sustainability, supply chain management, and operations and project management. And joining us from the UK, Adam Whitfield is head of compliance and ESG at supply chain risk experts Achilles Information Limited. And although based in the UK, he has over 14 years of international audit experience and has supported firsthand the implementation of their ethical business program in the UK, with both land and asset owners and developers and principal contractors using it across construction projects. Now, before I get to any of the questions for our panelists, and we have time for Q&A at the end, it's really useful to remember that the property and construction sector here in Australia employs over 1.4 million people, so more than mining and manufacturing combined. And the sector's supply chains are not just complex, but span both geographical locations and, of course, multiple tiers. And serious labour risks exist across the work site, so from site preparation and demolition and civils to construction and fit out and finishing trades, and then completion and landscaping, and then in the related transport services. And as we'll find out, materials have many areas of particular concern, from construction materials with extended and opaque supply chains, and looking at things like stone and timber and renewable energy solutions. From a personal note, I've recently been part of a 2-year University of Melbourne research project looking back through, or trying to look back through, construction supply chains of concern, including those for stone, landscape labour, and using timber as a comparison. But the two things we found out were, one, quite how difficult it is to see any further back than tier 2, even guaranteeing anonymity. And secondly, that many of our supply chains send out consistently conflicting messages. We want it cheaper and faster, but we want you to respect human rights. Or we want you to bring your human rights concerns to us, but we'll also give you a contract that could terminate everything if you find anything untoward. So the messaging needs to be much more consistent. And then, of course, as we're here, there's many ongoing risks, property and construction maintenance supply chains, cleaning and security. And as James said, there'll be a whole session on IT and supported services. So in this session, what we're going to try and do is unpack what we see as the 4 main gaps between C-suite and worksite. And that's the gap between specifications and substitutions, the gap between theory and practice, the gap between assumptions and actual knowledge, and then lastly, between organizational commitments, what we're committing to, and the resources, how we're actually resourcing those things. So let's hear just a minute or two from each panelist, not just about who they are, but what they do about human rights and modern slavery in this context. Anwen, I'll start with you. Can you maybe briefly just explain that intersection between your work and modern slavery, particularly within construction supply chains?
So hi, I'm Anwen Schumacher. I'm both a practicing graduate architect and I'm also a PhD researcher at Curtin University. So when I started my career in construction about over 10 years ago, I quickly realized that specifying materials for confidence in terms of human rights was exceptionally challenging. There was very little tools to track the origins of materials. There was almost no performance requirements. There was no information available on the risks. And very concerningly, there was no conversation. And so I often found myself unsure if my material choices were truly supporting human rights, and I did suspect otherwise. So this concern led me to go into research, and I'm now a PhD candidate at Curtin University. So my initial research focused on how the Australian architecture and construction sector is responding to modern slavery risks, found both on-site and within the value chains. So it was an exploratory study, and it was a bottom-up approach. We examined how architects, builders, engineers, procurement people, we asked them how they're responding to these modern slavery considerations and what they had experienced in their work in every day-to-day business. So I did identify that practitioners basically distrust the information available due to these sort of opaque and complex supply networks. And as a result, my research explores how it's looking at how integrating traceable value chains into the building design practices can help reduce these risks for architects, building designers, and engineers, and bring a little bit of visibility into these once sort of concealed supply chains. Thank you, Robin. That's me.
I already think we need about 6 hours for this panel, but sadly we are limited. So I'm going to press on, Anwen, and we can ask more questions in a moment. Sharon, again, can you maybe briefly explain that intersection between your work and modern slavery, particularly around construction?
Absolutely. Well, hello. The Design for Freedom movement, led by Grace Farms Foundation, is working internationally to eliminate forced and child labor from the building material supply chain. So I'm very honored to join you all, and your work, Anwen, is very analogous. So what we have been communicating is that every building tells a story of humanity, either of dignity or exploitation. And Grace Farms is a place, it's in the United States, and it was created on the premise that space communicates. and that we could create more grace and peace in the world through proximities between architecture, nature, arts, community, and justice. And our stake in the ground at opening in 2015 was and is to address modern slavery in a hopeful space. So Dr. James Cockayne, you brought the UN University to do this at Grace Farms in 2016 and 17 with a multi-sectoral approach. So as an owner, a social entrepreneur, and someone on the job site actually every week, I realized this question in 2017 was never asked. Are our buildings ethically sourced as well as sustainably designed? To date, the construction sector generally has been given a material supply chain transparency pass. So in order to build a more humane future, we're engaging the entire ecosystem of the built environment. This includes leading project owners, design teams, international large suppliers, universities, investors, artists, lawmakers, and most importantly, guided by those with lived experience. And each of these groups play a critical role to influence the industry, including mandating, specifying, and procuring a selection of lower risk materials from the beginning. And we do have a public space that can create public demand, where the architecture is already identifiable. You can see behind me, it's a river building. And it is, we're able to actually share a range of stories of both dignity and exploitation, including yours in Australia, according to the brave space that you were describing as well. And we are publishing a Design for Freedom international guidance and toolkit in a few weeks. So you'll have that opportunity to engage with the key issues. These three are finding and addressing embedded forced labor, pursuing ethical decarbonization, and to pursue circularity. All three principles are inextricably linked and fundamentally support the elimination of forced and child labor from the construction supply chain.
Thanks, Sharon. I think we'll need to come back to that toolkit a little bit later, because we are delighted to have any great resources which look at filling that, the transparency pass that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Deepan, again, before we dive into questions, tell us a little bit. You've got the glamorous Sydney background behind you. Tell us a bit about what you do and your work, particularly around construction supply chains.
Thanks, Robin. It's a real privilege to be here today, and I have to say the privilege to have the role that I do. So my work is primarily focused on procurement, and the title kind of the role that I play is responsible sourcing. So really looking at the key sustainability targets that an organization has. In this case, I work for Mirvac, which is a large Australian property developer, and looking at how those sustainability targets can be brought into our operational kind of footprint. And I think it's a really great time to be in this space, because even 10, 15 years ago, I think a lot of people hadn't even heard of the word procurement before. So it's kind of an area which is kind of a lot of people fall into. And then I have the chance to really make a difference and then hopefully drive some tangible outputs from that strategy piece that we're talking about, the C-suite, and converting that policy and practice and strategy into real life outcomes on the ground. I've got 20 plus years experience in procurement. A lot of that's been split between the automotive sectors and the infrastructure and construction sector. And I think what's interesting for me in this discussion is that Mirvac actually has its own in-house construction arm. So we basically manage that construction element for a lot of our property. And what that means is that for a lot of companies that would typically look at a tier 2 or tier 3, like the deeper layers of our supply chain, for Mirvac, those are the companies that we typically deal with ourselves because we have our own in-house construction arm. So it'll be a really interesting discussion today, and hopefully we can share some of the experiences that we've had in our space. Thank you.
Thanks, Deepan. And yes, that is it's a very different approach when you're having those sort of tier 2, tier 3 as direct relationships as well. Now, Adam, last but not least, I'm fortunate to know a bit about Achilles and to talk with your colleague Jake quite a lot. But can you briefly explain again that intersection between your work and modern slavery, particularly around construction?
Yeah, no problem. Nice to meet you all. So Achilles has been working really closely with main contractors or principal contractors in the UK really since the adoption of the Modern Slavery Act in 2015. So a lot of our clients and also their clients in the form of asset owners decided that they needed to respond more than just publishing
an annual modern slavery statement and uploading that onto the government registry. So we've worked closely with them now for the best part of probably 8 years to help them identify site-based exploitation or poor employment practice issues, and then identify opportunities that they can adopt their supply chain due diligence practices accordingly. So as a result of that, we've interviewed over 10,000 workers in the UK on construction sites and supported both the Centre for Social Justice and the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner to look at policy changes with regard to construction and exploitation risk in construction, which is seen as one of the 3 C's from a risk perspective in the UK. So construction, car washes, and the care sector has been the 3 primary modern slavery risks. So we work with them to identify on-site risks, and now really looking at their material supply chains as they start to react to EU and UK legislation that's focused more on the import of raw materials, steel, brickwork, and so on.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we're going to have to try and ask for some of those sort of the headline findings from 10,000 interviews with construction site workers, because that again is going to give us some extraordinary insights. Anwin, maybe this is a good time to come back to you and just ask maybe some of the key findings from your research, the research you've been doing, and ask how are things changing here in Australia?
Yeah, so exploitation in the construction sector, it's a historical issue in Australia, and it's flown under the radar for far too long. So it's great we're now starting to look at this. So the 2003 Royal Commission into the building and construction industry, it actually highlighted the use of what they called illegal migrant labour, with some firms then paying donations to trade unions as compensations for these practices when discovered. So my research at Curtin University found some pretty alarming risks and indicators for the Australian construction sector. So what might this look like? So underpayment, non-payment is widespread, but it's not a sole indicator. So contractual practices like cash payments, low pricing, excessive subcontracting, novation, Phoenix activities, these all help to sort of obscure the value chains, and these can perpetuate hidden forms of exploitation. Physical injuries, suicide, mental health are certainly common. They do help to obscure victim identification. What we find is that there were workers fleeing construction sites when federal police raids occurred historically. We found that migrant teens frequently lacked language proficiency. Because of this, then there was coercive control through the use of minders over migrant labour teams. We also heard of examples of migrant student labour used to lower construction costs per metre squared. Unsafe and overcrowded housing was really common, workers sleeping on site. There were evidence of bottles of urine and buckets of feces found on site. That should never happen. There was also excessive work hours or working on site after the site has closed. So regarding sort of material risks, we found that practitioners don't often they don't trust material certifications for sustainability due to the opaque supply chains. And this makes it really difficult for them to then specify with confidence for things like environmental and social performance. The main barriers were things like knowledge and experience, 63%, time was 52%, cost 45%, and other issues were 11%. So how are things changing? That's a really good question to ask. So in 2018, we had the introduction of the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act, which has required businesses to report if they earn a consolidated revenue over $100 million. So this has started to put attention onto the construction industry itself. But in reality, what we find is that there's a construction sector is about 450,000 construction businesses, and we have about 1,300 statements on the register right now under the construction sector. So that's about 2.8% that's actually reporting. It is important to realise that the Modern Slavery Act is designed to be improved upon, and thanks to reviews like the Macmillan Review, we're now seeing calls to lower this reporting threshold to between 50 and 100 million to capture more businesses.
Thanks, Anna. And that's kind of a fascinating point around not just obscuring the value chains, but obscuring victim identification. Everything just becomes not just harder, but more opaque, harder to find anything out about. Given that information, given what you've been finding out in your research, what solutions can you suggest? What is that gap between, specifications, what is being specified, and what is actually going into building sites?
Yeah, so what we find is that material substitution is a really big problem. So what the architect specifies may not necessarily get put into the building at the end. So material substitution refers to the replacement of a specified material with alternatives that are deemed to meet the equivalent performance standards, often during the estimation or construction phase. So substitutions, they're legally permissible when the equivalent performance is maintained. However, they frequently involve cheaper materials and they sometimes lack adequate traceability or ethical assurances, which undermines the architect's sort of original intent. So why does substitution occur? Cost pressures, availability of material, contractor preferences, installation changes, limited local supply, lead times, lack of specialized tooling. These all drive these sort of substitutions that we find in the industry. And these factors create an environment where cost considerations often can override ethical sourcing decisions of a material. So in the construction industry, buildings are a performance-based system. However, unlike essential performance requirements such as fire safety, structural, hydraulic, or civil performance, there's really no mandatory expectations to address modern slavery risks. So even if an architect specified a material from Global Green Tag or a product from the Green Building Council of Australia Responsible Products Program, it could actually be substituted. And we found that what we found is that sustainability discussions in construction, they often overlook the social aspect and they often tend towards the environmental aspect. So this is another complicating factor. There are other things that increase the risk of substitution, and that's like contract novation. So that's basically where the architect's influence will diminish once the contract is handed over to another party. Reports have shown that substitutions can affect 26 about 50% of the materials specified originally. And this sort of erodes the architect's ability to maintain ethical design standards that they may have picked for the original material. So what can we actually do about this? Well, we need to basically be asking suppliers about modern slavery risks and advocate for material standards that really prioritize transparency and anti-slavery in all materials we use. And this is particularly important for substitutions. Anti-slavery measures should be treated as a performance metric in building design almost. This would reduce unethical substitutions and uphold fair labor practices. We really want to see greater supply chain and on-site auditing. We want to see larger construction companies and large construction projects onboarding ethically sourced materials and labor conditions to help set a standard that the rest of the industry can then follow. We also really want to bring up substitutions and human rights with clients and normalize that within conversations around the project planning stage. And lastly, we also found that it's really essential to ensure that any anti-slavery clauses in contracts include a due diligence follow-up. Thank you, Robin.
Thanks. I love that concept of anti-slavery measures as a performance metric, like not just a one quick tick of a box, but actually an ongoing thing. Now, Sharon, you have as your backdrop the amazing Grace Farm building, which I was reading about online over the last week. Can you maybe suggest some solutions? Obviously, design for freedom, but some solutions to help close that gap between theory and practice, what actually happens on site?
Absolutely. So, being a place offers a way to not only convene, but also, excuse me, to create proximities, right? So, excuse me. Because I did have a team of many consultants actually on this project, that I could go to them first when I had this realization that the labor transparency pass was given to the entire sector. And so in doing that, I found out that leaders, I'm talking about, the executive teams that we're referring to here, principals, deans of architecture and other business schools, had literally not thought of the construction supply chain being at risk. So what that afforded us is an opportunity to create a working group, which I did. No one really had the opportunity to say no. So we started a working group that was established actually back in 2018. And this is exactly what we're talking about. How do we engage the executive teams to pay attention? So this is a voluntary group that has now swelled to 100. And we have also, and these are, you can find them on our website, designforfreedom.org. And what that shows you is that first it was really centered in the US, but it's expanding to expanding globally. So we have accelerators that are now initialized in the UK and in India. And with our new Design for Freedom International lead, who is not only a stone expert, but human rights expert, we do need to be tuned into each country's geopolitics, the regulations that exist among different countries, industry norms. Some countries like Japan don't even have specifications. They work in an entirely different way. And especially those with lived experience to effectively be able to communicate and work together. So what we did is we opened with a report, the first of its kind in 2020 with 30 industry experts. So again, it's coming from within the industry. It's not pressed upon it by human rights experts. And that's a big differentiator. And then the other aspect is, so that was the original report. And then it includes the full ecosystem again. And then in 2000, they've said, okay, now tell us how to do this. We published our report in 2022. And that was a very, it was the first, the first way to start to engage the whole industry. And you learn a lot. And now 2 years later, in the next iteration, we're making that an international guidance and toolkit that you will find, James, your contribution will be part of that, along with 20 other experts. And we're updating specifications, sample contract language, using construction lawyers' input, new material research with Versic, and other resources. So this is an important way, like you're saying, to really close the gap. And the way that we do this is we have been bringing together at a summit at a place every March. We're now in our 4th year. And so we call it a summit. There's no networking because it is about action. It is about really those that are committed to being able to fuel the movement. And so with that, we are looking to convert the highly opaque supply chain to a transparent one. It is a very big task. We need everyone's pressure points, like their means and methods that everyone can apply, which you'll also find in our materials.
Thank you. You said making it about action. I guess I'd be interested, maybe everyone would be interested, how are people actually using Design for Freedom to achieve real positive impacts for people, not just for the buildings, but for the people in the construction supply chains?
So first we really need to alter the language around specifications and procurement. That's the first thing, I believe, is that in fact, we need to recognize that we're subsidizing our ROIs with forced labor and child labor without recognizing the human cost. And this is an important part of the built environment. It's always driving costs lower without the revealing of the human cost, right? And what I also want to recognize is that we're limiting innovation too, because the R&D dollars are not going in to fund new innovations if they're not going to be commercially viable. We saw that with the solar panels. Look at the innovation over the last many decades, limited, right? And we can also, so the term that we are using is that we can no longer accept the slavery or the exploitation discount. And that's starting to reverse the thinking, because people are asking, is this ethical sourcing going to cost us more, without thinking about the human condition, those that we care so much about, in terms of ensuring that we are not only creating a sustainable solution for the planet, but also for people. So we coined another new term, a second term called ethical decarbonization, going along with a just transition, but it means that in future environmental certifications and regulations of sustainable building materials and systems, the impacts on health and well-being of humans will be included as the integral part of the health of the ecosystem. So terminology is really important, right? And then secondly, it's the action part of it. So we have Design for Freedom pilot projects on 3 continents. We'd like one in Australia. Many of you are on here that might be able to do so. I'd love for you to take a look at our website, because we have 12 projects, including one for Human Scale, which also manufactures office furniture. It's an opportune way to start to apply now Design for Freedom principles into their manufacturing as well as their own building. And we have RFPs out now to be able to be recognized for new typologies, so we can learn more and close that gap. And then we have university and data analytics. Those that are professors on this call too. Stanford University has launched with us a concrete project to determine the provenance of concrete. If you take a chunk of concrete, how are you going to know where that came from? This is complex problems, right? You can do so maybe with wood, but Dartmouth's Tuck Graduate Business School is working on the economic factors that I was describing. Versic is adding new research, again, to our upcoming guidance and toolkit. And we also have Design for Freedom competitions for architecture students. This is an accredited universities in North America, but eager to extend this internationally. So our invitation is to include all the good work that you're doing. Dr. James Cocaine and Ann Wynn, all of you here, it's really important to be able to showcase that, because your materials, your mining is literally, really the exporting of your building materials is at 120 billion for iron ore, 35 billion in gold, lithium, 8 billion, your materials are ending up in projects around the world. So we're eager to showcase what you are doing to do that. And we have a public place that we're also able to do that with our exhibitions. There's a lot that we can do, right?
There's a lot. There is a lot. I love that concept of no longer accepting the slavery discount or the exploitation discount, as you were saying. And James and team, I think we need a whole other session on ethical decarbonization. That's a whole topic that we need to allocate some time to. Deepan, let us turn. What solutions? Let's go into the solutions mindset. What solutions can you maybe suggest to help close that gap between assumptions about our supply chains and actual knowledge?
Thanks, Robin. I think a lot of the comments, the research that was highlighted in Anwen's work is really relevant to the work that we're doing. And I guess just a couple of comments around converting this, I guess, the theory into practice or these assumptions into reality. First and foremost, I've spent a lot of time in the last several years, obviously presenting concepts around, how to tackle modern slavery risks at board level through to executive down to project level across multiple companies and industries. And we often initially start talking about things like policies, procedures, risks, so forth. And for me, that is just the foundation piece of the discussion. It's just the start. If you kind of stop there and say, we've written a great code or a policy or procedure, that doesn't really take you much further, I think, in real life. And so what's really important is to translate that into real life action and get started quickly, but also look at, how these steps that you're taking have impacts into the marketplace. So as an example, in the work that we're doing today in our company, we've looked at a whole bunch of different key risks, and you touched upon some of them, Robin, in the work that have been done by the University of Melbourne. So everything from materials like stone and services through to landscaping, cleaning, and then imported materials that we're getting from overseas countries like steel and aluminium as well, components that have got those materials in them. So it's a broad cross-section of risk that we're looking at. And I think to really look at bringing this to life, there's a couple of key thoughts that I have. One is that first and foremost, you have to tackle this issue, I think, to be really successful, not as a technical problem, and I'm talking about inside an organization, right? Not as a technical problem. So not just looking at policies, procedures, self-assessment questionnaires. That's all the technical stuff that is important. It has to be done. But inside the company, you've got to tackle it as a cultural and as a systems issue. Because if you don't look at it from that point of view, you're not going to shift things. Because ultimately, what we're really talking about here is you're looking at a piece of culture change within an organization, of changing the way that business has been done in the past, which might be driven on a whole bunch of other factors, and now adding other elements to the decision-making process. And of course, a lot of us are already doing that today. But if we're just looking at it from a technical perspective, I don't think we'll get as far as we should. And we've got to recognize also, as part of that shift, is the kind of supply chains that we're talking about. So the point that Anwen made about material substitution is really relevant, because I've worked in different industries where, for example, in automotive, I would say what I'd use the term is quite a static supply chain, where you might have the same supplier and the same material content in a manufacturing process, pretty much sourced for 10 years straight. It won't change for 10 years. It'll just be widgets being pumped out of a factory for 10 years in a single kind of linear fashion. In construction, it's very different, where you will have, project by project changes happening, site by site, state by state, sometimes even within a project, area by area, depending on the type of project and infrastructure project you're talking about. So if we don't recognize the complexity that's present, then it's a problem. And so obviously we'll look at a whole bunch of different things technically. It might be supplier panels. We will look at KPIs in our contracts. We look at audits, and especially obviously in a risk basis. So where there's higher risk of audits, high risk of issues, we'll commence audits into that area. But there's another factor when I talked about cultural change I want to just impress upon people. And we did a piece of work which was really interesting recently, where we did a roundtable with our top suppliers, with some of our industry partners. And when we talk about cultural change and systems change, it's not just within the company that we're working in, but you have to look at it as cultural change and systems change for the suppliers that are your partners in this space as well. And there has to be kind of a lot of work put into engaging with suppliers, not just sending them questionnaires. It doesn't stop at just sending a questionnaire or a written response. It's that real engagement, and engagement, not just the procurement team or just the responsible sourcing team, but a holistic, front from the whole company. So the project managers, the directors, the people that are actually directly involved in the project are supporting this the whole way through. And then having that dialogue with the suppliers, I've always found that engagement is the key that, you know, opens a lock to having real life discussions and making it real. And then, of course, all the other technical things pop in, your KPIs and your audits and your follow-up discussions, that drives the change post that. But without that engagement and that strong support as a holistic support within the business, the supplier mindset won't necessarily change as quickly as we would like. So all those factors are really important.
Deepan, you mentioned that step-by-step approach and supplier engagement. I know, you know, Mirvac has worked on a lot of Green Star or WELL or like rated buildings, and Anwen was talking about, you know, the responsible products framework, all of these. Are these helping to change the market, even if slowly?
Absolutely. So even if you look at Green Star as one example, obviously, for those of you on the call that have worked in this kind of against this standard before, there is obviously a rating system. There's credits that you basically go after to hit a certain star rating. And today, the Green Star rating, especially if you want the higher star ratings, there will be a responsible procurement subsection or section within there with credits allocated to work around responsible sourcing, including obviously the risk of modern slavery. So it absolutely helps receive credits within the pathway. And I would just say that, so it is another factor that we should take into account. But it's like anything else, what I've always found is that, especially in a role like mine, sitting in with the project teams, again, there's no substitute for that engagement and that cultural change. So sitting in with the project teams, really workshopping and then the ongoing support at that project level to understand, well, this is your pathway, for example, for Green Star, that's fine. Or it could be in the roads business. I've worked in examples where you've, you know, look at ISCA ratings, for example, similar kind of thought process. You might have a pathway, which is fine, but how do we actually work through this decision-making practice at a package level? Who are our key suppliers at that package level? Can we have preferred panels in place? And then how do we monitor that performance as we work through the project? So again, that's going to be the real shift that'll happen in the industry through that process. And the last comment I'd add is obviously is collaborations as well. So we're lucky in our space, we have the property councils working group, and there are other collaborations that can help, but not necessarily at a package level, but, you know, making sure that we kind of sending a signal to the market that these are things that are important to us as a collective, which is really, really helpful.
Thank you, Deacon. And again, there's so much to explore there. Now, Adam, can you tell us, I guess, about that gap, the last of the four gaps that we were talking about, the gap between high-level commitments, commitment and actual project resources? And again, what are you actually seeing? What are you actually hearing on these project sites?
So I think I can only really reiterate some of the things that Deepan has said. Traditionally, from a C-suite, it's signing off a piece of paper and then forgetting about it for 12 months. But money has started to talk in the UK, and as a result of that, a lot of the big frameworks, multi-billion dollar frameworks, have required organisations that are involved with them, some of the main contractors, to commit to minimum levels of due diligence or reporting on potential exploitation or modern slavery. And if they've not been willing to do that, they've not been able to access some of that work. And it's obviously a huge lever in an industry that's operating a 1% margin. You can't turn down work for what's sort of tens of thousands of pounds worth of due diligence. I think the other kind of the big bit, we know from interviews that 72% of those that we spoke to on site had no idea of what a modern slavery indicator might look like. We also know that of the individuals that we spoke to, 34% of those had not received terms and conditions of employment. And that comes down to a transient workforce being employed at multiple tiers, quite often the day before in the UK, where they're getting a mobile phone call to turn up to site to carry out work. And so actually the commitment that we're seeing at board level and that we're seeing at some of those larger organisations is to actually review the way that they engage with contractors, subcontractors, and some of the lower tier self-employed contractors. So how are they providing them with information on what the minimum standards are that they should expect on site? So working hours, ability to access their own mobile phone, ability to leave the site when they wish to do so. We know that 10 individuals that we spoke to had their pay paid into the gangmasters account as opposed to their own. They weren't also provided with access to their mobile phones. So the first thing is to educate those that are on site in a way that they understand. It's no good kind of doing an e-learning video that's great for kind of everybody that's probably sat on this call, but isn't relevant to a migrant worker that perhaps isn't aware of the rights that they are entitled to in a country that they may not be familiar with, in a language that they're potentially not familiar with. So the commitment that we see kind of driving things is to take those people that are the decision makers, that are signing off the policies, that are adopting the responsible sourcing strategy, and ensure that they are providing the adequate resource to their teams, but also ensuring that they're using a risk-based approach to that, and also using the knowledge or the information that's available to them. So whether that's us or some industry bodies and so on, it's taking that and leveraging it as opposed to kind of using it to say, isn't it great, you know, we did X, Y, and Z over the last 12 months. Well, that is great, but actually use that to maybe identify different languages that you need to provide site inductions with. Maybe you need to identify certain groups of people. We know cleaners or slingers and signallers. Normally there's issues. Cladding, we know has massive issues in the UK. So use that to identify the workers that you need to spend more time with, to engage and to support, as opposed to just using these things kind of to make board reports look good.
And just to follow up on that, once you've identified the workers that you need to be spending more time with, or identified the vulnerabilities, what are those next steps? Like, how do we make this real? As you said, not just e-learning for those behind desks, but on site. How do we lean into that?
So there's two things. So one thing that we're trying to push now with the new government in the UK is some changes to policy, and also in terms of how it looks from minimum standards of training. So not just looking at health and safety training for workers, but also looking at awareness around modern slavery for those workers as part of their minimum competency requirements. That's at a broader policy level. But most organisations that we're working with, I refer to it like a coffee filter. So if you imagine you've got 1,000 people on site, maybe 100 different contractors and so on. So identifying maybe those contract companies that are presenting greater risk to you, maybe because of some of the things that you've heard from workers, and then using that to engage with those contractors to find out, is this something that they're doing for reasons that are particularly egregious, or is it a lack of knowledge and capacity within the organisation? I would say that probably 7 times out of 10, the companies that we've then gone on to visit their own offices, look at the policies and procedures they have, these are kind of like family outfits. They've been around for 50, 60 years. They're trying to continue to work themselves. And so actually their activities they're cutting corners as opposed to going out there and directly wishing to exploit workers. So it's trying to identify, use that knowledge to go and visit those organizations to decide, do these people just need some support? And we can use our knowledge as an organization to kind of upskill them and start to drive performance from the bottom tiers of the supply chain? Or is there an issue here where we have to look at these guys because there are reasons that they're doing this, and it's not just because actually it's a small firm that are trying to react to the requirements of some very big organizations?
Thanks, Adam. I would love to explore lots of these issues, but we're going to turn to questions now. And I think there's pretty much one question for each of our panelists. I will ask you to keep your answers short so we can try and get through them. Anwen, there's a question there. Where in all of this is the client? So often the developer. A lot of those clients have set budgets that the contractor has to meet, which doesn't consider a lot of the social and sustainability considerations. How do we start to address this?
So we found with practitioners, it was roughly 20% of our practitioners had experienced an instance of a client asking about modern slavery at least once. And this is remarkably low. So we really need to see that being normalized within the client architect relationship with the developer particularly. That would be my recommendations, is just to bring that up with them, because it's very, very unknown. It's a new area and that needs to be normalized in the conversations.
Thank you. There's a question here from James Cockayne, which I'm not sure we should allow, but he might be asking it on someone else's behalf. So I'm going to let this one through. Sharon, what are the materials where there is the biggest opportunity for positive change? I know this is a very global question. Biggest opportunities for positive change in the next 3 to 5 years. So steel, PVC, stone, and why are the prospects better there, do you think? You're on mute, Sharon.
Okay. Great. Yes, great question, because it also differs from where you are in the world, but and the recyclability, the circularity of that particular product. I've been down the supply chain of timber. I think timber has a very promising opportunity, and due to the tracing and also the rise of the ability to, it's just that there's a more awareness around it, and also the global flows and regulations that are occurring. There's not only modern day slavery regulations, but there's also actually timber laws that are becoming more rigorous. So I've been in the Haida Gwaii Nation, the nation of Haida Gwaii, just back from there, and the Yoshino Forest, and there. And so I believe there's a trans possibility with timber. Also, the low-hanging fruit is textiles, because think about it, there was no conversion yet between the garment industry's textiles and the interior textiles in the built environment. To us, we believe that's a very low-hanging fruit because of the scrutiny. First, foods cannot be counted within clothing, and therefore the agriculture and clothing, and I mean, the garment textile industries are promising.
Thank you. That's a really good point about textiles, yes, and that transferability. Deepan, I'm so sorry, I'm going to fling you the hardest question that I can see. Supply chains are complex and chain of custody is hard to trace, but how do construction companies delve deep into their supply chain beyond tier 1 suppliers to tier 2 and beyond? This is the question of the moment, particularly around visibility of modern slavery issues, and what tools can they use?
Yeah, great question, and is the $1 million question, isn't it? I think first and foremost, a couple of things, and I'm certainly not here to spruik any particular tools or systems, so I'll avoid talking about any specific technologies as such. But first things, depending on the risk and the category that we're talking about from a procurement standpoint, the first thing I'd say is actually avoidance is the first step. So what I mean by that is not necessarily for materials, but if you're looking at labor services, so trades and labor services, and let's just take the example of cleaning as a simple example. We generally try and avoid the use of outsourced labor within that cleaning contract to avoid the risk happening in the first place. So what we would like to see, generally speaking, is if the cleaning contractor that we've appointed has X number of staff on site, basically performing their duties, that we actually have them as direct employees on payroll, and then we can conduct due diligence on the payroll practices of that organization directly. So you're capturing that risk as best as possible. So avoiding that risk occurring in the first place, if possible. Obviously, for materials, a whole different kettle of fish, especially if you're looking at imported materials. And look, there are a lot of tools out there that can look at audits and risk factors, and they'll amalgamate audits from different systems and different external organizations. So there's a lot out there, but fundamentally, I guess if I go back to the point I was making before, is looking at it from a systems approach. So it doesn't necessarily have to be very expensive tools. It could be as simple as looking at, again, that discussion with the supplier, making clear requirements that, from the beginning set, that we want to see this information come through from the organization, be it manual, and if it's manual, we want to see these things come through. And actually working through that chain of custody. So, for example, in materials, what's interesting is, and I just throw one example out for thought, is that we will often look at traceability materials for other reasons outside of modern slavery purposes. So, for example, we might want to understand where steel and aluminium is coming from for quality or traceability or warranty purposes, right? As a simple example. So we might have, for example, mill certificates and so forth, explaining where the actual raw materials come from for that traceability reason, which will be for a totally different reason typically. But investigating those data sources will help understand, that supply chain naturally. So it's not the panacea for everything, but again, think about it more from that systems approach. Look at all the different data points that you have. Sometimes there are HSE systems that will give you accessibility to people that are coming on site that are like your tier 2s, tier 3s as well. So there are other ways that you can get that information without necessarily just going into a very expensive system. But of course, there are also systems out there. So it's really thinking about it from that and really understanding the system that you operate in, and then putting those requirements through so you can delve further. That's probably the best answer I can give. Thanks.
Thanks, Ethan. Now, we will need to wrap up our session. We are right on time. I will answer that last question in my wrap up because we've covered a lot of things. A few points on which to close. Firstly, design for before Sharon needed to. The Property Council of Australia's Human Rights and Modern Slavery Working Group, which Deepan has mentioned, has released reports on grievance mechanisms and remediation, the pathway to respecting human rights, which was metrics for impact and success in collaboration with Edge Impact. There's also numerous resources from the UN Global Compact Network Australia looking at the different risks and sectors and solutions you can find online. And in answer to that question about how can government do better in bringing sector level improvement, I think there's a need for three things at the same time. Transparency-led legislation, which we have, the Modern Slavery Act, but also trade-led action and due diligence-based at the same time. Once we have those three things in place, we have much better opportunities at looking at that sort of sector-level improvement as we go. I will say a big thank you. We've covered some extraordinary things, that labour transparency pass, Achilles' sort of focus on exploitation risk, not just construction, but car washes and care, obscuring the value chains and victim identification, but also, as Anwar mentioned, modern anti-slavery as a performance metric as well. And importantly, making sure we bring this to life. This is not, as Deepan said, just a technical problem, but one that needs to be tackled inside every company as a cultural and systems issue. Thank you. We've had some amazing panelists. I'm going to hand back to James.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you to the panel for really getting us off to a wonderful start, a very rich conversation that I'm sure many of us will be thinking about for some time to come. And thank you, Robin, for setting the standard for moderation, which I will try to keep up now. May I please invite the panelists for our next panel onto the screen. I'm sure my team will assist with that. It gives me great pleasure to welcome the panel for this session on finding consistency between competition law and anti-slavery collaborations. We're going to have a wonderful panel. I'm pleased to welcome Gina Cass-Gottlieb, the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Thank you so much, Ms. Cass-Gottlieb, for making time in your very, very busy schedule, particularly at this time of year, to come and spend some time with all of us this morning. Ms. Cass-Gottlieb commenced her 5-year appointment as chair of the Commission on the 21st of March in 2022. Before she joined the Commission, she was a senior and founding partner of Gilbert and Tobin's competition and regulation team. Ms. Cass-Gottlieb has over 25 years' experience advising on a large number of merger, competition and regulatory matters in Australia and New Zealand, and is widely recognised as one of Australia's leading competition and regulatory experts. She was appointed by the Commonwealth Treasurer to the Reserve Bank of Australia's Payment Systems Board in 2013 and reappointed in 2018 and again in 2023 for a further 5-year term. This is the regulator of access to payment systems in this country. Gina was appointed to the Financial Regulator Assessment Authority in September 2021. For 10 years, Gina was also on the board of the Sydney Children's Hospitals Foundation. She chairs the Digital Platforms Board and Financial Service Inquiry Board and is a member of the Consumer Data Right Committee, Enforcement Committee, Infrastructure Committee and Communication Committee, Mergers Review Committee and the East Coast Gas Market Board, Electricity Markets Inquiry Board and Supermarkets Inquiry Board. As if that were not enough, Gina is also a member of the Bureau of the OECD Competition Committee, something very relevant to what we're going to be discussing today, given Australia's commitment to the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises. So how you found time amidst all of that, Gina, to make time for us this morning, I'm not quite sure, but we welcome it and appreciate it, and we'll turn over to you shortly. I'll just introduce our two other panel members. We're pleased also to have Dr. Darian McBain, CEO of Outsourced Sustainability Officer Asia and a visiting professor in practice at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Darian is a globally experienced Chief Sustainability Officer, an advisor and board member. She's a world-recognized expert speaker and author on sustainability, ESG, supply chains, ocean economy, business human rights, and sustainable finance. Darian is a UN SDG pioneer for a sustainable ocean economy in 2021, a Fast Company Most Creative People in Business in 2020, and I love this one. Darian was named one of Asia's top sustainability superwomen. She's also the chairperson of the board of Be Slavery Free and brings incredible experience in collaborations to tackle modern slavery in supply chain. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Darian McBain. And last but by no means least, we're also joined by Kate Turner, Global Head of Responsible Investment at First Sentier Investors. Kate is based in Sydney, where she and her team are responsible for defining and delivering strategy globally for First Sentier Investors. This includes supporting investment teams to integrate ESG factors into their investment processes, engaging with clients and stakeholders on responsible investment, and creating learning and development opportunities for staff across all levels of the firm. In addition, because that's the theme today, people are multitaskers on this panel very clearly. Kate is also a board member of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia and First Sentier Investors Australia IM Limited. And she is notably chair of Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific, which we're going to hear more about in her remarks this morning. Kate is also a member of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. So again, a huge array of experience that Kate brings to this panel. So I'm sure what you all want to do is hear from these wonderful panelists and less from me. And so on that note, I'll frame our discussion to say we're really thinking this morning about a couple of questions. What are the competition law issues potentially raised by anti-slavery collaborations? How are business, civil society and other organisations addressing those concerns as they collaborate to tackle modern slavery? And what can we learn perhaps from experiences overseas? So with that, I'm going to open the floor to Gina Cass-Gottlieb and begin, Gina, if I may, with this question. The Commission is in the process of producing guidance on sustainability collaborations and Australian competition law. Can you tell us what the intent of those guidelines is and how they seek to address competition issues relating to anti-slavery collaborations? Thank you.
Thanks very much, James. And initially, I do want to say what a privilege it is to be on this panel with Darian and Kate, and also to have the opportunity that James is offering up here to get questions and to listen and learn also about the challenges that there are before this community in taking action against what is truly undoubtedly abhorrent patterns of behaviour in terms of human trafficking and all forms of modern slavery, which have no place in our society and which are a global challenge. We recognise there is a need for multi-stakeholder collaborations to disrupt and prevent these crimes and to support victims and survivors. And James, in terms of the question, what did we want to achieve through the guidelines, was to achieve that competition law is not a barrier to the public benefits from such collaborations, and to give guidance about where we consider that the law does not prevent such collaborations, and the nature of activities where the law does not prevent it, we believe, the competition law, but those where it does, because we do have in part some highly technical and codified parts in our Act, some more technical and codified than in other jurisdictions. Then what are the avenues that the ACCC has to provide assurance, authorisation, exemption? So we had two objectives: to show where it doesn't apply and also to show where we have exemption processes. And we have received a lot of value from the submissions that we received, including, James, from your office and more broadly in response to our draft guidance. I'm sure you're going to go into questions that are in more detail, so I'll pause there on the overall objective, but I do want to then get into, at an appropriate time, areas where we consider collaborations do not raise a competition law question, and then ones where we would like to engage further, and we will have fast-track processes for doing so.
Well, thank you. I think we would welcome, if you'd like to set those out now to frame up our conversation, Ms. Cass-Gottlieb, those considerations of where the issues don't arise, and then where they do arise, how they're best addressed. Would you like to set that out now?
I will. Thanks very much. So, firstly, there in many instances, and we have in the draft guidance described it as sustainability, but we will, when we finalise, which will happen soon, make clear that that is a broad, as for instance the UN definition shows, a broad definition of sustainability, including anti-slavery collaborations. When we look at the areas where we consider that conduct involved in collaborations is not likely to raise competition law concerns. So the first broad category is sharing information. And looking at that sharing of information, we consider, I'll give you the types of information that in a short, we're planning to issue a short guide in very accessible language and then a longer one. But the short guide will identify as, in our view, not raising competition law risk. So it's sharing public available reports, surveys, whether multilateral, independent, individual, OECD, UN, with one another to understand issues such as risks or opportunities that may arise in supply chains, relevant government policies, sharing views on relevant government policies and potential solutions, that organising and attending industry forum discussions, including with expert facilitators, sharing good practices and a view of best practice and guidance that it achieve, or there's a record of achieving sustainability objectives, jointly auditing and sharing information on modern slavery risk of suppliers, regions, sectors. There was quite a discussion that I came in at the end of there on sectors to help obtain greater or more reliable data to inform businesses, not-for-profits, charities, government agencies' own supply chains to assist in compliance with regulatory reporting obligations and consistency in the manner of engaging with regulatory reporting obligations, including on the consistency of the data that can be used for that. So it's where businesses are required to report on matters, and we know that that requirement is extending to a broader set of Australian companies than before. So in relation to anti-slavery compliance, to share information to facilitate consistent data collection and efficient reporting for supply chain partners. So that's an indicative set. There will be others, I'm sure, people can refer to where they're basically benefiting from it, either groups of businesses, individual experiences of what is the best way to meet the legal requirements in the most efficient and effective way. But they are some examples that had been put to us, including, James, in your submission and other submissions, that we wanted to make clear we do not consider raise questions. But just to talk about ones that get into the territory which, due to really the highly codified nature of our cartel prohibition, I've got the 50 year behind me on the screen because it is the 50th year of this Act, though probably the most codified elements in relation to cartel prohibition in Australia didn't come in until 2009 because of a shift to criminal prosecution. We would never use criminal prosecution in relation to collaboration that is for the public benefit in this nature. We have civil, it is really about serious hardcore cartel conduct. So I do also want to give everybody an understanding about that. But just to look at where it would be advisable to get advice and consider engaging with the ACCC. This is where businesses would move beyond information sharing and best practice guidance formulation, which otherwise would be implemented individually on the basis of the business's individual determination about what's best for their business. If it moves to a desire to actually, between competitors, if the parties don't compete, these issues don't arise, but between competitors who want to agree together that none of them would deal with suppliers who don't meet certain labour standards, for instance, under our Act, that's frequently been called a collective boycott, and that is different than a collective negotiation within a separate decision, but a collective boycott that, for instance, don't meet certain labour standards. That would be worthwhile engaging, and our guidance covers several processes that relate to it. We're committed to helping understand the authorisation process and making it as accessible as possible. In addition, we conduct a fast-track process. So firstly, we have an open door approach that will occur in a confidential manner. We also conduct a fast-track approach, which is intended to shorten the authorisation period, where there are arrangements which are largely consistent with ones we've previously assessed or had experience with. So we build up, and the sector could build up, an understanding of the way we would engage with that in a fast-track way. So those, I thought, were useful indications of how we have been listening to submissions we've received. We will release final guidance before the end of the year, and we will want to continue to engage. But I hope that's a good start, James.
It certainly is. Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Cascott-Leib. I think your remarks this morning offer a lot of comfort to many who've been following these conversations, and your signal that the guidelines will be published by the end of the year, and in this dual format with the shorter version and then the longer version, I'm sure will be very, very welcome. I can see some holiday reading ahead for some of the hundreds of people on the call and others who'll be watching when we post this recording on YouTube. Against that backdrop, I might come now to Dr. Darian McBain. Darian, thank you so much for calling in from Singapore this morning. You have extensive experience working on these kinds of multi-actor, multi-sector collaborations to tackle modern slavery risks in an array of supply chains. In that experience, what do you think makes for a successful anti-slavery collaboration, and how have you seen them be organised in a way that ensure they're not anti-competitive?
Good morning, James, and thank you very much for having me here. And Gina, wonderful to hear your comments, and really looking forward to Kate's comments as well. So James, as you said, I mean, I've worked in supply chains all around the world, and actually my PhD was in impacts, social and environmental impacts in global supply chains. So it's an area that I've worked in quite a lot. And I think I'm the chair of the board of Be Slavery Free. And so from that perspective, we believe that the laws and regulations should facilitate and not hinder business collaboration to address both environmental sustainability and human rights. And what the research shows is that where there is a likelihood for breaking environmental regulations and great environmental impacts, you also have a higher likelihood of human rights abuses. So not to say that they always are consistent, but there is a higher likelihood. So apart from the global frameworks, whether we're looking at the UN SDGs or OECD guidelines, etc., we also know from the research that you need to consider environmental and social issues together. So I thought I'd give you some examples of some collaborations that I've been a part of over the past decade or so, which really has sought to bring out the benefits of collaboration on environmental and social issues. And the first one I'd go to from the seafood industry. So I used to work for the largest seafood processor in the world. It was headquartered in Bangkok. But I'll go back to 2014. I was working with WWF Australia on palm oil, and I can remember this article coming out from The Guardian in 2014, and I was talking about slavery at sea. And so it looked at people who were being trafficked onto vessels in the Gulf of Thailand. They were being forced to work in poor conditions and with no pay. That fish was being then transported back to Thailand, where it was processed and turned into fish meal that then got fed to the prawns or the shrimp, and then those shrimp or prawns, they're the same thing. I'll just tell you that's a technical definition. Shrimp, prawns, the same, US versus UK definition. Anyway, and then they're processed and sent around the world into supermarkets that we all know and love and then consumed. And I can remember within WWF is talking about, wow, this is, incredible. What are we going to do? How are we going to address these problems? There were overseas supply chains. These were human rights abuses. What could we do? Anyway, so one of the world's largest retailers, Costco, came together with a Thai actor at that time, CP Foods, to form what is now known as the Seafood Task Force. Now, the Seafood Task Force lives on to this day. So post 10 years, that collaboration is still going. And it is the biggest collaboration, and I think the longest collaboration that I have ever worked on, that really set out to drive supply chain oversight and continuous improvement through a number of different mechanisms. Some of them, I think Gina has certainly mentioned, auditing of value chains. It included sharing of good practices and looking at how to address the areas where there was a lack of information in particular. And an interesting part about seafood is they're not so much chains as they are webs, because different actors can sometimes be a supplier and sometimes can be a buyer, although obviously ultimately it all comes up to the retailers and the brands. And so in this collaboration, you ended up having Costco and Walmart, two of the largest retailers in the world, plus many others that you've heard of, like Tesco, Ahold Delhaize. You had the three largest pet food companies in the world, who are actually Nestle, Mars, and Smuckers, an active part of it. You had all of the supply chain actors. You had NGOs and civil society all coming over with this ideal of preventing human rights abuses, environmental degradation, and what's called illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, or IUU fishing. And going back to that academic point, Stanford University actually did some studies just highlighting how where there is a likelihood of IUU fishing or illegal fishing, you also had a much higher likelihood of human rights abuses, particularly at sea. Now, because this is all brought together under a not-for-profit set up in the United States, we were primarily operating under US competition laws, which are very strict and taken extremely seriously. So at the start of every meeting, an anti-competition statement was read, specifically outlining the purpose of the meeting, the kinds of conversations that were permitted and those that were not permitted. And for example, it ruled out any discussion on matters of competition or price. So it was very clear what we could and what we couldn't talk about. But, reflecting what Gina said, very much the emphasis on sharing good practices. One of the things that we did from the start was to go to what was the 7th tier of the value chain, or the 8th tier if you're a retailer. So going back all the way to how the people were hired onto the vessels that were catching the fish that got turned into the fish meal and went through that value chain. And so it was a very big deep dive into the different aspects of the value chain. But it was recognized that no one company could solve this problem alone. No one country could solve this problem alone. It wasn't purely a Thailand issue. It wasn't purely a US issue. So you needed to bring both the buyers and the supply chain actors together and to make sure that you were really going to have progress. And then, although it never got to a complete ban on buying outside of the Seafood Task Force rules and regulations, at least you had the guidance for good practice that the buyers were then setting up their purchasing practices to align with. And I think that's reflected in some of the comments from the previous panel about what's happening in the construction industry. So the collaboration wasn't perfect. As I said, it continues. There were some Australian players who were part of that. It was very much global collaboration. But I think it does show how you can bring together different supply chain actors. And through that collaborative approach, you can have a positive outcome both on environmental and social impacts. I just reflect that recently, in the last few months, I was at a CBOS meeting, also in the seafood sector. So CBOS is Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship. It's the 8 largest seafood companies in the world who came together with the Stockholm Resilience Centre to look at seafood stewardship, so very much across the human rights and social dimension, as well as the environmental dimension. And it's just came to my mind, James, as you asked the question. I mean, in this meeting, because you have such large players, you actually have a lawyer present. So physically at every meeting, there is a lawyer present. Whenever you join a Zoom call for any CBOS meetings, you have to agree to the antitrust statement that you read before you get into the Zoom call. And it's taken very seriously. I can remember I was writing notes, the lawyer interjected and said I was running a workshop for CBOS and said, you know, this is not an area that we should be talking about, and move the conversation in a different there just for form. It really does guide to make sure that everybody complies with the regulations. And I should have said that with the Seafood Task Force, all members had to sign up to the member agreements and the bylaws, which very much included the antitrust compliance policy as well. And I think finally, I would come to another piece of work that Be Slavery Free does. When I started working with Be Slavery Free, I reflected on my own experiences working in the corporate world, that actually it's pretty scary if you are in a corporation and you are looking for modern slavery, evidence of modern slavery, and if you actually find it, what do you do about it? Because you don't want to be too loud about it, because you could have a regulatory enforcement against you. You could have actions from NGOs naming you. You don't want your suppliers to take any negative action or dropping you while you fix it. Now we have a much stronger approach now with due diligence, and obviously with the New South Wales regulations as well as the federal regulations. But with Be Slavery Free, we set up Business Fight Club. And the idea for that was what happens in Fight Club, it stays in Fight Club, that we talk about what the good practices are and what you can actually do if you find some evidence of modern slavery in your supply chain, because actually sharing those good practices and letting other people know that, you know, you're having difficulty in this area and understanding how they have solved those issues, I think is a really important approach for businesses to be able to take. And I'd like to say that as we look at increasing due diligence processes, and there's a further emphasis on how to resolve issues of modern slavery in supply chains, we really want more collaboration in terms of how to resolve the issues and how to take a best practice approach than limiting how much we speak to each other, because the further issues around modern slavery are driven down out of the light where nobody can see them, nobody talks about them, then I think the longer that they will continue to exist. So I'll pause my comments there, James. I hope that helps answer your question.
It certainly does, Darian. Thank you so much for sharing with us that very rich experience of impact at scale through collaborations designed very carefully to ensure that they're compliant with antitrust and anti-competition laws. It's good to see some of you taking advantage of the Q&A function. We have a question there that's for you, really, I think, Darian, unless I refer it to Tyler Durden, which is, can anyone participate in BSF Fight Club? Perhaps I'll just let you answer that question.
You don't need to go back to Tyler Durden. And yes, the idea was taken from Fight Club. Yes, if you contact, you can certainly contact me or contact Be Slavery Free. Fight Club is still up and running.
Great, thank you. So please do lodge your questions in Q&A, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end. But we're going to turn now to Kate Turner, who's also been involved in some important collaborations at significant scale to tackle these issues, including Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking Asia Pacific. Kate, could you tell us a little bit about that and how such collaborations address modern slavery risks in value chains, and where and how you navigate any competition issues that may arise?
Sure. Thanks, James, and thanks for having me. So I guess just a bit of framing from the investor lens. So First Century Investors, the organisation I work for, is a global fund manager. We're headquartered here in Australia, and we manage about 240 billion across 11 investment teams, lots of different asset classes, investment styles. And my job is working individually with those teams to help them identify and address issues like modern slavery in the supply chain. As investors, we're important actors in the value chain. We have leverage over the companies that we invest in, so we can engage with them to encourage them to improve their practices. But we also have relationships with policymakers, with standard setters, with data providers. And I think the way that we think about it is we have this responsibility to allocate our capital and to use that influence in a way that contributes to a sustainable financial system, and that is underpinned by a sustainable economy and society, which I think we can all agree does not have modern slavery in it. So that's the way that we're thinking, and that's the way that we're working on these issues individually, is team by team, company by company, one by one. It's obviously a really important thing to do, but back in 2020, when we were seeing some of the challenges that we were facing, when we were seeing those challenges be faced by others across the industry, we came together with a number of other founding investors. So together with ourselves, there was Australian Super, Aware Super, Ausbil Investment Management, Fidelity, and the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, and at the time, Walk Free and Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, to say, we're all working on this on our own. Do we think that we can achieve more and go further and faster if we do it in collaboration? So that was what led to the founding of Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking APAC. We're a collaborative of 50 investors now right across the APAC region, not just in Australia. We have about $12 trillion in assets under management, and our key job is working with the companies that we invest in the region to find, fix, and prevent modern slavery and labour exploitation in their operations and supply chains. So I think the reason that we felt that we could achieve more together than if we did this differently is we thought there were benefits to investors and companies in terms of having a common set of asks. I think firstly, for efficiency's sake, at the time, 2020 in Australia, a lot of companies were saying to us, oh, investors keep talking to us about this topic, but they don't know what they're doing. They're all asking us for different things. We're happy to take guidance, but when we get 10 investor meetings asking for 10 different requests, then that's not really helpful for us. It's also obviously less efficient for investors. I think it also, especially with emerging topics or topics which are sort of underappreciated, shall we say, I think it helps to signal importance for us to say, because we often, especially when we're engaging with companies outside of Australia where there isn't a regulatory framework in place, they say to us, like, why should we care about modern slavery? Investors only want to know about climate change. They're not asking us about this topic. So to be able to say that we're a coalition of $12 trillion worth of investors really helps to get the attention of those companies and signal the importance to investors. I think, as I mentioned, there was a lot of engagement happening in 2020. Not a lot of that engagement was very sophisticated. So I think we really identified the need to build knowledge amongst the investor community. And that's where Walk Free and Fast, as our knowledge partners, really came in to help with sort of knowledge sharing sessions for the collaborative, but also supporting individual engagements with the fantastic knowledge that they brought to the initiative. So those were sort of the rationale for thinking about the initiative. What we've done over the last 4 to 5 years and what we continue to do is act in a number of different ways and to try and press on different parts of the system to create that change. So the first thing that we did was an investor letter. So we sent it out to the ASX 100 companies, expanded it to ASX 200 companies. And this was really about trying to correct some of those misconceptions about different investors wanting different things and come up with a common set of asks from investors to companies that they invest in about how we expect companies to go above and beyond legal compliance and really take meaningful steps, and some of the meaningful steps that we thought that they could take to address this issue within their operations or supply chains. We've done quite a bit of policy advocacy, both in relation to the Australian Modern Slavery Act, but also other regulatory regimes across the APAC region. Our sort of main activity has been collaborative company engagement. So we have a focus list of 24 companies, which are split across the region. They're within the consumer staples, consumer discretionary, healthcare and tech companies. So we developed a set of engagement guidelines, and then each company has one lead and up to 5 support investors who are engaging with those companies. They work out, knowing the company, doing research, meeting with the company, they work out an engagement plan, which sets sort of milestones that they're aiming for across finding, fixing and preventing modern slavery. So those are the 3 pillars that we work with. We have an ESG data sub-working group. We've developed a set of metrics that as investors are useful to us to be able to make decisions and understand the risk within our portfolios better. So we've been engaging with companies, with data providers, with standard setters about getting sort of better and more consistent disclosure of those metrics. And then finally, as I mentioned, our knowledge partners have been providing over the course of the years, each year they provide about 5 knowledge sharing sessions to members to help build their knowledge and deepen their work. So I mentioned one of our focus sectors was IT. Last year, we had a knowledge sharing session where we had civil society organisations that were working on the ground in India, Indonesia and Thailand come and talk to us about their work with victims of modern slavery on the ground on a day-to-day basis. So it was a very different story than the one that we get from the companies that we invest in. So just really trying to build our knowledge and help sort of build our critical thinking skills so that we're asking the right questions when we go into company meetings on this topic. So that's kind of the initiative and what it's achieved. I very much echo Darian's point that no collaboration is perfect. It's far from perfect, but I do think it has really helped deepen knowledge, has helped sort of better action be taken from the investor community as a collective on this topic over the years. I think one of the first steps that we took when we brought the initiative together was to seek legal advice. So we obviously work across the region. We originally sought legal advice under Australian law, but subsequently Singaporean law as well. We were really fortunate that Jones Day agreed to provide us with pro bono legal support and continues to provide that to this day. They've helped us a lot over the years. That advice covered competition law, collective action and insider trading. And they provided to the steering committee, provided quite an extensive piece of legal advice. And then they also provided a sort of 2-pager for each of the jurisdictions where they've provided us advice for us to share with members, with some sort of basic guidelines and key issues to be aware of, the do's and don'ts, which kind of thankfully align with what Gina was telling us earlier. So around, don't agree to blacklist companies. You can agree on the common goal of eliminating modern slavery as long as members are able to implement that goal in different ways. We can't agree to vote the same way when we go to an AGM, but we can discuss voting. So I think that's sort of in a nutshell what we're doing and how we're approaching sort of competition law and trying to not fall foul of it. I think having specific guidance, having specific legal advice has been really, really helpful for us, both in terms of getting members comfortable with what we're doing, with setting some ground rules, and as new members joining, helping them to understand the sort of environment and how we're operating within it. I do think not every initiative is fortunate enough to have such generous pro bono legal advice over such a long period of time. So I really welcome the guidance coming from the ACCC. I think that will be really helpful to help sort of fast track and ensure that these collaborations continue in the future. Thanks, James.
Thank you so much, Kate. Again, really rich and fascinating experience that you've had there in IS APAC, and really getting down to the nitty-gritty of how you collectively engage with businesses that investors are invested in. We have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and a couple of themes I think have already emerged, which I might put to the panel. The first one is, I think, this point about the need for legal advice and for potentially other forms of advice to engage effectively with this kind of work. The examples that you've given are examples of pretty big organizations doing this successfully, the kinds of organizations that can afford to either spend money on legal advice or get support, as you described, Kate, in pro bono terms from a legal advisory firm. So the question is, what does this mean for much smaller organizations? Are there going to be challenges for SMEs in engaging effectively in anti-slavery collaborations if we're relying this much on legal advice? In the guidance, as I've understood it, that you've outlined, Ms. Cascott-Leib, in certain circumstances, there may be a need to engage with the ACCC and pay a reasonably small but not insubstantial fee for to apply for an authorization. So the question here is, how will this all play out for smaller organizations, and is that something we all need to be thinking about how we tackle? Question generally to the panel. Please feel free, any of you, to jump in if you'd like to. Please.
So James, one point I'll add in there, we are also working on a checklist, in effect, which we have thought would be more helpful for smaller businesses, not-for-profits, that may not be in a position to have legal advice, though will be wonderful, where people can get pro bono legal advice, as Kate was identifying, but just to help guide areas where, and which is also why our short form, more accessible guide also just seeks to put in as clear and simple language as possible areas of operation that we do not think are likely to raise concerns. So we are trying to make that more accessible. Also, our sort of open door, come in and talk to us if people are concerned. We will more easily then be able to give them the steer. This we think is appropriate. It would help you to have some advice, or this we don't think. So we hope that those will help address or give some greater assistance in that respect. We also do always, in relation to our investigation and enforcement approach, take it proportionally. So we expect greater capacity in terms of due diligence from very large global companies and organisations than we do for Australian SMEs or not-for-profits. We, of course, know they're can be subject to regulatory requirements in terms of human rights, but in terms of our law, we do take a proportionate approach.
Thank you. I'm sure many will take comfort from that. Kate, were you trying to jump in?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think there's also a role potentially for industry associations to play here. So for as investors, collaborating on sustainability issues is something that we do a lot across various different sustainability issues, not just modern slavery. The UN Principles for Responsible Investment, which is our kind of industry association for RI globally, has put out guidance, like they have sought legal advice and have put out guidance on competition law considerations when collaborating as investors around the world, and they've looked at lots of different jurisdictions. So I think there is sort of a convening role for some central bodies to play in different industries here potentially, because it's obviously a challenge that we face as investors, but also when we're engaging with companies, we're always, because one of the key questions we're asking them is, how are you collaborating on this issue? And it's something that we get back from them quite regularly.
Maybe from the example that I gave with the Seafood Task Force, membership fees were tiered depending on the turnover of the companies or the organizations. So you found SMEs and not-for-profits paid a different membership fee to the large corporations. And then those pooled membership fees, the legal advice and ensuring that we had the right legal representation. And so that was a way to ensure that you had an equal access by different size players across the organizations. And I guess the other thing I'd just flag is this is very much a legal conversation. I often find in these conversations, the answer is always go to the legal advice. Yes, we need the legal advice, but there are plenty of other professions and skills that also are needed to create a more robust idea of what the solutions are to ending modern slavery. So I would just emphasize that not all the answers are going to be purely from legal advice. The purpose of some of the collaborations can be to take a much broader scan across different professions and different actors and what they're doing to make sure that you're getting a more balanced perspective.
Points well made. Thank you. The second theme that seems to be coming through the questions, I think, is well encapsulated in a question from Claire Bartram, which I'll read to you now. Do you have any thoughts on navigating collaboration/information sharing where the parties have a goal to avoid procurement of high-risk products or from high-risk regions, such as Xinjiang region? Does this raise any competition issues? So the question here is, well, if the goal is to move capital and custom away from suppliers that are relying illegally on forced labor and modern slavery and towards suppliers that aren't doing that, how do we navigate collaboration and information sharing to achieve that goal, particularly with products or regions that we know are very high modern slavery risk? Anyone care to jump in on that?
I think Kate gave an interesting example just before in terms of collaborations coming together with shared goals, which of course are heavily informed by legal obligations, and then sharing information, best practice, and audit and other information, identifying where there's higher risk. Up to there, we are still in sharing information, allowing ultimately independent decisions, which are the areas we avoid. The question for us, which would need more consideration, is if that moves to actually an agreement or understanding, we will all blacklist these regions because we've all decided they meet that criteria. That is the point at which it would be advisable to consider with advice or by coming in to engage in the open door point with the ACCC. But I'm sure Kate and Darian will have other examples of how these sorts of possibilities are being thought about.
Yeah, thanks, Gina. I definitely don't want to fall into the trap of providing legal advice because I am by no means a specialist in this area. But I suppose what was kind of messaged to us when we started on the IS-APAC journey is we can agree to common goals like eliminating modern slavery as long as different members of the organization are able to implement that goal in different ways. So it kind of stops short from what's in your question, Claire, about that agreement on we're not going to do X. So that's kind of what we're always careful to avoid with IAST, and I guess with the goals of IAST, it's not something that we've sort of had to grapple with at this point in time. So it hasn't been an issue to date, but I think it's a really good question because I guess this is actually what we need is we need some sort of coordinated action when it comes to high risk regions and areas if we're going to see that change.
So organizations like Be Slavery Free, they help to collaborate, they help to bring together different sources of information. I mean, I always love their weekly summary of what's happening around the world, so they can be almost a one-stop shop to understand what the issues are, what current actions are, and also to facilitate some of those dialogues, through webinars and through convening people, very much to have the discussions, as Gina talked about, in the sharing good practice perspective, rather than telling people what they need to do.
Thank you. Some real consistency in comments there. And if I can just offer my 2 cents from the moderator's chair, I think there's also clearly a role for government here. If government decides that products from certain suppliers or regions are too risky, then it's open to government to send signals while still leaving it up to buyers, whether public or private, to decide on their own risk appetite. So in New South Wales, the way this works, for example, is that all public agencies in New South Wales that collectively buy about $42 billion worth of products and services each year have legal obligations to conduct modern slavery due diligence and to report on what they're doing in that regard, and to take reasonable steps, quote unquote, to ensure that they're not procuring goods and services made with modern slavery. My office can play a role in signalling to them what level of risk we think is associated with certain products or product categories. And indeed, we do that through publishing an inherent risk identification tool, but it's still up to the buyer to use that information, which we've provided in a centralized way, in their own decision-making and to make their own choices. Well, that probably just about wraps us up for today. Before we hear a wrap up from my colleague Lucy Forbes, I'd just like to ask you all to join me in thanking Ms. Cascott-Leib, Dr. Darian McBain and Ms. Turner for their wonderful inputs and very helpful exploration of this complex terrain. It is complex terrain. It's still early days in the development of these kinds of collaborations. And I think you will have, Ms. Cascott-Leib, some very interested readers for the guidance that you have forthcoming in the weeks ahead. So thank you all to all of the panelists. I'm going to turn over now to my colleague Lucy Forbes, Principal Policy Manager, to offer some wrap-up remarks for this morning.
Sorry, I'm not sure whether you can all see me or hear me, but I wanted to say thank you. Wonderful. Thank you very much, James. And I also want to extend my thanks on behalf of our office to Robin, who moderated our first panel today, and to all our panelists, Gina Cass-Gottlieb, Darian McBain, Kate Turner, Anwin Schumark, Sharon Prince, Deepan Samaya, and Adam Whitfield, as well as to everyone who joined this morning, or depending on where you are this evening. In this morning's panels, we heard, first of all, about the importance of ensuring that the decision makers at the top levels of companies, and by the same token at the top levels of government, understand what's happening and what the risks of modern slavery really are on the ground. So this challenge is particularly acute in the construction sector, where, as we heard, multi-layered and complex materials supply chains and labour subcontracting and tight margins make it challenging to ensure that the good intentions that are set out in board-level sustainability or ethical procurement policies are carried through all the way to practice, all the way to the worksite. But more broadly, this question of ensuring that we understand what the risks are on the ground is at the heart of all anti-slavery work. The need to go beyond a tick box approach to, as the panel acknowledged, to price in the human cost of exploitation and to centre the workers and the people who are impacted by our value chains and by our business activities. And this requires, as we said, a real cultural shift rather than a technical shift within our organisations, within our industries, and within the economy as a whole. Another key to success for the anti-slavery sector is exerting our leverage collectively. So no one business or government, as we saw here or overseas, can solve modern slavery alone. And so in the second part of this morning's session, we heard from experts about the value of collaboration to promote anti-slavery objectives, and vitally, how businesses can do so consistently with their obligations under competition law. So this discussion highlighted how helpful and really how essential it is to have clear, accessible legal advice and guidance to help businesses of all sizes understand how their modern slavery and competition obligations overlap. And I'm sure many of us will look forward to reading the ACCC's short and long form guidance on the beach this summer. The work Darian led in the Thai seafood industry really demonstrates how collaboration within clear parameters consistent with competition law can increase transparency down the tiers of a supply chain and create clear guidance for an industry. While Kate's work with Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking APAC also demonstrates the importance of utilising shared leverage to mainstream anti-slavery issues, articulate clear and consistent expectations for companies, and share knowledge. So this spirit of collaboration is also why it's wonderful to see so many people online and asking questions of our panellists. We're really building a community of practice here, which has the potential to drive real and meaningful change. So for those of you who can join tomorrow evening from 5 to 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, the second day of our online forum will feature an update from the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery on his Australia country visit, as well as sessions, as James said earlier, on building a survivor-led anti-slavery movement and addressing risks in ICT, or information communications technology, supply chains. We'd also be very grateful if you could provide us some feedback via the post-forum survey, and also use the QR codes on the screen right now to follow us and subscribe to the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's newsletter for updates from our office. So with that, thanks again very much to our moderators, panelists and attendees. Wishing you all a lovely day and hope to see many of you online tomorrow.